We're in the second week of our 4-week sermon series on the Old Testament book of Jonah. Now, when I say Jonah, more often than not, the first question that comes out of somebody's mouth is, was Jonah really swallowed by a whale? And sort of the whole discussion of Jonah begins with that question, and it sort of ends with that question. And the reason they're asking that question is because the very last verse of chapter 1, we left off last week in chapter 1, and the very last verse says this right here in verse 17. It says, and the Lord appointed, and that's a strong word. That word appointed in the Hebrew text could be translated ordained even. It's a really strong, God did this. God appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Now, the Hebrew of that text is great fish, not whale. But the ancient writers really would not have distinguished between a whale and a big fish. So it could be either, but either way, it would be impossible, naturally speaking, for Jonah to be swallowed into the belly of a whale or a big fish for 3 days and survive. That would not happen. He would for sure die. There's no sense in going into the science and trying to have some obscure scientists say, well, no, he could get oxygen this way and the stomach acids wouldn't. No. That's just, he would die for sure. We don't even have to go down that road because this is not presented as something natural. This is presented as something that is miraculous. Jonah is being miraculously saved by God through a fish, a big enough fish to swallow him into its belly. And he's going to stay in the belly 3 days, 3 nights, on a journey back to where he began at the bank of the Mediterranean near Palestine. He's heading home, whether he knows it or not. Now, if you believe in the resurrection of Jesus, which is by far a greater miracle. I mean, the idea of somebody being in the belly of a fish for 3 days, yeah, that's a miracle, but somebody being dead for days and rising from the dead, that's a greater miracle. If you believe that, it's not going to be particularly difficult to believe the miracle that God miraculously allowed Jonah to live in the impossible, naturally speaking, belly of a whale or fish on a 3-day, 3-night journey. You're not going to get hung up on that. But if you're still hung up on that, let me at least throw you a little lifeline here. There are some people that believe in the authority of the Bible, but when they read Jonah, some scholars say they think it's more of a parable about a real prophet. We know Jonah was a real prophet from 2 Kings 14, but they believe a parable about Jonah as a real prophet. I don't think that's true, but if you want to believe that, that's fine. What I want to do is get past the question so that we can really talk about the incredible message in the book of Jonah. So the fish thing, just put that on the shelf for now. Most people who read the book of Jonah, readers have discovered it is an ingenious, artistically crafted work of ancient literature. It's only 58 verses. There is an incredible economy of word in 58 verses in telling a sophisticated, multi-layered story as the story of Jonah. It's kind of like if you saw that Disney film Up, and the first 10 minutes of that film told this incredible story, just the economy of story in 10 minutes. And we're all crying as if we just saw a movie. It was a 10-minute little thing. But that's what the book of Jonah is. It's like 10 minutes to read, and it's an incredible story in 58 verses. And so in those 58 verses, if we go back to chapter 1, and Keith talked about this last week, I'm not going to repeat it, except just to say, God told his prophet Jonah, it starts off saying, to go to Assyria, the big city Nineveh in Assyria, and to warn them of God's judgment. Give them a message of warning. And implied in that is if they somehow miraculously repented, God would relent and forgive them. And so Jonah doesn't want to go. Assyria There's all kinds of ancient empires. There's the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire, all these things. But Assyria was in particular, a very excessively violent, cruel empire, more so than the others. It was like a hellhole. If you were taken over by the Assyrians, it was like the worst movie you could ever watch, what would happen to you. And they had been around for more than 100 years by the time of Jonah. So Jonah grew up hearing about Assyrian atrocities. So it would be like sending a Jewish rabbi to the street corners of Berlin in 1940 and telling that Jewish rabbi to preach against the atrocities of the Nazis. Good luck with that. And so Jonah, we have to assume, just because he's human, would not want to go to Assyria, to Nineveh, maybe just even to risk his own possibility of an incredibly cruel, torturous death. But even worse to Jonah than that, even worse than that, would be the possibility that these incredibly cruel and horrible Assyrians that are just doing terrible things in all the surrounding countries, that somehow maybe Jonah's preaching would succeed and they would repent and they would not be destroyed, but they would be spared. And in Jonah's mind, why in the world would God want to show mercy towards such evil people who have been so destructively terrible to God's people? So as we saw in chapter 1, Jonah decides to go the exact opposite direction than Assyria. And he gets on a boat. I'm not going to go into the whole story, but God sends a storm, and the storm, long story short, the sailors realize this is not just a storm. This is a supernatural storm. They end up discovering Jonah is the reason for it. Jonah admits it. Yeah, I'm running from my God, Yahweh, who's the God of heaven, who made earth and sea, and he's chasing me. Just throw me overboard and the storm will go away. They try hard not to, but they eventually have no choice. They throw Jonah overboard. And the minute Jonah hits the water and begins to descend now toward a watery grave in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, and this is chapter 2, and he descends toward the bottom, for the first time in the whole story of Jonah, he prays. He begins to pray to God. And so chapter 2, it says that when Jonah was in the fish, he said this prayer, and it gives us the prayer that Jonah says. And when you think about it, this prayer is one chapter of 4 chapters. So in a book that's having this incredible economy of story of 58 verses, 9 of them are giving us the words of Jonah's prayer, which shows you that this is not fluff. This is not trying to show, just throw religious language into a book. This has a very strong narrative purpose in the story of Jonah. And in the prayer, Jonah starts off with just the first verses talking about the reality in poetic terms, the reality of being in the water, sinking further and further in the water. And so let's just watch what he says here in verses 2 through 6. He said, he descended deep in the realm of the dead. He says, this is poetic of the water, deep in the realm of the dead. Verse 2, the waves and breakers swept over me. Verse 3, I said, I have been banished from your sight. Verse 4, he goes on, the engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. So just imagine this, seaweed wrapped around his head, the waters engulfing him, the deep surrounding him. And he says, to the roots of the mountains, I sank down forever. That's all poetic language to describe how he was experiencing the water. But if you're at all familiar with the Psalms in the Bible, you're going to recognize every one of these phrases are not really original to Jonah. Every one of these phrases, if he was truly a prophet of God, which he was, he would have had these memorized, and these are the Psalms that are coming to his mind as he's descending further and further into his watery grave. But the reason why they're so important here in the narrative of Jonah is because the reason why they're in the Psalms. And that's because they describe the universal human condition ever since Genesis chapter 3. This is poetic language. The water engulfing, sinking further into a watery grave, being banished from the face of God forever into the bottom of the sea is the Bible's poetic language of describing the human condition of everyone because of death entering the human condition, because of sin, because of human rebellion against God. And so Jonah is no doubt taking responsibility for running from God in the sense that he knows he brought this on for himself. And so he talks about the grace of God at the end of verse 6. He says this about the fish. He says, "But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit." Again, that's you can find that verses like that in the Psalms. This is very much in the Psalms, but he's saying kind of the way the Psalms talks about God's salvation from our death, salvation from our condition of brokenness and being banished from the presence of God. Jonah is using that language to talk about where he is right now in this story. And so he is genuinely thankful. He is genuinely praising Yahweh, which is what the all capital L-O-R-D is, the name of God, the Hebrew's name for God, which meant he is. He's praising God for delivering him. This is a great part of the prayer, and all of us can join in and see ourselves in this prayer. But then Jonah does what an obnoxious teenager would do at a pool party. He just does a big cannonball in the middle of the prayer. The next verse, he says this in verse 8. He says, "Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. But I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you." Turn away is translated in the word that means refuses. And in a sense, Jonah doesn't see himself in, this is verse 8 at all, because to whom is Jonah referring when he says those? Well, not moi, but I am faithful to you. This is the justice equation. Those who, in their own free will, freely choose to turn away from the love of God and worship idols, well, what goes around comes around. You reap what you sow. If you don't want the love of God, well, then you're going to get the justice of God. And to Jonah, that's a very clear equation, just that he just doesn't see himself in it. Here's a guy whose head is wrapped with kelp. Here's a guy who's been sinking to the bottom of the sea because he's been running from God, because he doesn't want to do what God wants him to do. And he's proclaiming the justice of God for all those idolaters out there, and he's proclaiming his own faithfulness to Yahweh. But one thing he never does in this prayer, he never says a single word repenting for running from God. Because, see, to Jonah, it was completely justifiable. Again, why in the world should God show love and mercy to the most violent empire in ancient times, who committed such atrocities against God's people? In Jonah's mind, there really is no way the love and the mercy of God is compatible to what he knows about the justice of God. This is the justice of God, and the mercy of God, the grace of God, the love of God is incompatible with God's justice. And God needs to be just toward the Assyrians. They're evil. Now, many of us, maybe you have a problem reconciling the justice of God with what you know as the love of God. And you don't have a category for how could God have to show justice to those he loves. We live in different times. We're in a different cultural and historical context. So our struggle is on the opposite end of Jonah's. But Jonah's struggle is really real. And he's got this view of God. He's got this image of God, a lot of which is absolutely true. But it's smaller than the truth. It's reduced. The truth of God is out here, and Jonah has truth of God, but it's inside this box, and there's truth in this box, but he's missing all this other truth. He just has the justice of God. And every time in this story when the real God shows up, it pushes Jonah more and more into anger and despair. And we're going to see that. Because, see, Jonah doesn't see himself as those who cling to worthless idols, even though he's got, in many ways, an idolatrous image of God, a God of his own making. He doesn't see himself in need of God's grace, just like the Assyrians, just like the idol worshipers, because he doesn't see himself as one of them. If he really grasped the grace of God and what the book of Jonah is trying to show us, the book of Jonah ends up being a story more about God than Jonah. If he really grasped the grace of God, he would have reversed the order of his verses. So it would have been like this. Verse 8 would have been first. Those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them. Absolutely true. That's a true verse. It's a true statement. But God, not but I am a faithful person of Yahweh, but I'm inside verse 8. In so many ways, I'm inside verse 8. In so many ways, I don't even know you, half of you, but I know you're inside verse 8 because I know you're human. But God. In spite of verse 8, but God, but you, Lord, my God, brought my life up from the pit. This is the order of the gospel. And it's not the order Jonah sees himself in. He doesn't realize that the reason God saved him with the fish is not just so that he could have grace to Jonah so he doesn't die, but it's so that he can show grace to Jonah so that Jonah will live and that Jonah will be able to show God's love and grace still to the Assyrians. That's why God sent the fish. And Jonah doesn't get it at all. A lot of Christians today don't get it at all. That the reason why God has shown you mercy and grace is not just because he wants to show you mercy and grace and bring you up from the pit of this fallen human condition in spite of your idolatry. But it's that, but also so that he can use you to show his grace and mercy to the Assyrians in your life, to those you don't think deserve it. Whoever that is for you. We all have different Assyrians. See, a lot of churches, I'll be honest with you, and it's cringeworthy, a lot of churches are pastored by Jonahs. Jonah's a prophet of God. Jonah knows the scriptures. Jonah can recite the Psalms inside the belly of a fish. You try that. Jonah knows good theology. Jonah has correct theology. A lot of churches are pastored by pastors that are like Jonah. They have good theology. They believe the right things about Jesus. If you're involved in their churches, the praise is truly genuine, truly thankful for God's grace and saving us through the death and resurrection of Jesus. And you'll grow spiritually being involved in those churches. But when a church is pastored by a Jonah, and I have to be honest, sometimes I'm a Jonah. Sometimes I see those people out there, and I don't have the sense of God's grace. I don't speak with grace about them. I don't speak to them with grace. And when we hear a pastor who's being a Jonah talk about the outsiders and talk about outsiders in the way we hear them sometimes talk, it sounds so self-righteous. It sounds so tribal. It sounds proud. And it's not only embarrassing as Christians to hear that in the public media, but it's also repulsive. Not just to us, but it's repulsive to everybody else outside the church. And Jonah's Jonahism was repulsive to God. See, because what happens is the very next verse says something really strange. It says this in verse 10. It says, and the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah onto the dry land. It's as if God's feelings toward Jonah's prayer at this point, Jonah was doing so well, but at this point, he still hasn't repented for running from God, and now he's talking about those people out there who are idol worshipers, and they deserve what they get, but I'm faithful to Yahweh, and at that point, the nauseating feeling God had toward Jonah's prayer is almost as if he just put it into the fish, and the fish couldn't stomach Jonah any longer, and he just vomits him up. In the Old Testament, whenever somebody's talked about in a metaphorical way of being vomited, that's never a positive thing. You don't want to be among the vomited in the Bible. For example, in Leviticus 18, it says that the land itself was so nauseated by the excessive evil of its inhabitants, it says it vomited them out of the land. There's other places as well. That's what's happening with Jonah at this point in his prayer. And in this story, the fish swallowing and vomiting Jonah is not just a metaphor for God's nauseating judgment toward Jonah's prayer and his pride and his self-righteousness and his tribalism, but it's also a mercy of God at the same time. Well, that's what Jesus says. So here's why I told you I don't think Jonah's a parable. I think it really happened. Again, if you believe in the resurrection of Jesus, it's not that hard to believe this story happened. But here's what Jesus says in Matthew. He says this in Matthew 39, chapter 12, verse 39. A wicked and adulterous generation, so Jesus is calling it like it is, but he's not toward the Assyrians. He's talking here to the people of God. A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. But Jesus says, the sign of Jonah being in the belly, well, let's just go ahead and read it. I'm getting ready to get him out. He says, for as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man, that's Jesus' favorite term about himself, will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And he goes on and he says, the men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and now something greater than Jonah is here. Now here's what Jesus is saying, that the story of Jonah, like he talked about the whole Old Testament, was always in ways pointing to him. And he says the story of Jonah and the fish was true. It was God being gracious to Jonah so that he could be gracious to the Assyrians, the Ninevites, and so God rescued him miraculously through the fish, and he was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights, but that was the lesser. The greater Jonah is here. The true Jonah is here. The greater Jonah who God is using to save the world you don't expect a person to be in the belly of a fish for 3 days and live, and you don't expect a person to be dead for days and to rise from the dead, but that's going to be the ultimate sign that the grace of God is not only pulling you out of this watery grave, this engulfing waters that are keeping you and banishing you from the presence of God forever. He's not only using the death of Christ and taking all your judgment with him to the grave and coming out the other side in the sign of Jonah in the resurrection of the dead, but not just saving you, but he's using you. He has saved you so that he could use you to bring his grace to those out there, to bring his grace to whoever the Assyrians are in your life, to bring his grace to those that you might not think deserve it because you don't deserve it neither just as much as they don't. Through the prophet Jonah was a sign that the true Jonah, the greater Jonah, the one whose name itself was the Hebrew word for salvation, Yeshua. That was Jesus' name in Hebrew. We say Jesus because it's been translated all through the centuries, but it was Yeshua. So when somebody called Jesus, they called Yeshua. Salvation. The salvation of God. The one in whom God's love and mercy and God's justice perfectly come together to those who turn to him. Amen.
Let's stand together. We're going to sing one more song. Old school Crossing people hopefully remember it. We haven't sung it sometimes. If you don't know it, it's a lot of words. Take in the story. I think it tells well the story of Jonah, our story in a lot of ways. Let's sing along with Ricky or listen along.
I was an orphan lost at the fall, running away when I'd hear you call, but Father, you worked your way. I had no righteousness of my own, I had no right to draw near your throne, but Father, you love me still. And in love before you wrote the world's foundation, you predestined to adopt me as your own. You have raised me up so high above my station. I'm a child of God by grace and grace alone. You left your home to seek out the lost. You knew the great and terrible cost, but Jesus, your face was seen. I worked my fingers down to the bone. Nothing I did could ever atone, but Jesus, you paid my debt. By your blood I have redemption and salvation. Lord, you died that I might reap what you have sown, and you rose that I might be a new creation. I am born again by grace and grace alone. I was in darkness all of my life, the day from the night, but Spirit, you made me. I swore I knew the way on my own, head full of rocks and heart made of stone, but Spirit, you moved in me. At your touch my sleeping spirit was awakened. On my darkened heart the light of Christ has shone. Called into a kingdom that cannot be shaken. Heaven citizen by grace and grace alone. So I'll stand in faith by grace and grace alone. I will run the race by grace and grace alone. I will slay my sin by grace and grace alone. I will reach the end by grace and grace alone. Church, receive this blessing. May the God of peace himself fill your heart with his light and give you peace. Have a blessed week.